Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Into the Terminal. Today, we're going to be talking about some account management techniques in our critical path, and then we're going to pivot in our deeper dive to talk about pluggable authentication modules. Nate, you want to show us some account management things? I think we started the episode title with like, "Who's this Bob guy, and why is his
Yeah,
account still active?"
yeah. Maybe I should have made the account name Bob instead of test user. Man, poor planning. Well, anyway, just it translated in your head. Test user is also Bob. All right, so there's a couple tools that are useful when managing with accounts, and the context here is like you have maybe a temporary account, like for a contractor or something, or maybe it's actually a temporary employee, or perhaps an employee when you know that maybe their last day is a certain day, and you want to make sure that their account gets locked out when or either you want to lock it out right now or you want to lock it out on a certain date. So it's a couple tools for that. We're also going to talk about password tools because that's kind of relevant here. You could just change a password, or if a password's been compromised, whatever. Enough talk. Let's actually do some things. So first of all, I have a user called test user, and I'm showing you Etsy Shadow because you can see they have a full normal like user account here, right? They've got a password hash set. They've got some usual identity information and whatnot. The first thing I'm going to do is show you how to lock test user. So user mod is a tool that has a bunch of user modification flags that you can use. -L is to lock an account. We're just going to say lock test user because, test user, whatever. We want to lock that account. Now, if we look back at Etsy Shadow, you're going to see that at the beginning of the password hash, see before here we had the hash, right? It just started with this quote. Afterward, you use afterward, you'll see that it's got an exclamation point before the password hash, right? That means that it's locked out. It means that, yes, there's a password hash in there. We haven't lost the user's password. But now if they try to log in, their password's not going to work, right? And I forget. They may even get a note that they've been locked out. Okay? But obviously, we still have the hash, and there's a reason why it might matter that we still have the hash. That is if we want to unlock the account. So if we go back up and change the -L to a -U, this will unlock the user, right? Now, if we look at the shadow file again, we'll see that exclamation point is gone. And these quotes, I really think that that Google Docs has bit me again here, Scott. Those quotes are not supposed to be there. Those those were thrown in there by a copy and paste fail from Google. Stupid.
So Nate, quick
Stupid
question:
transformations. Sure.
Why would we lock the account instead of deleting the account?
Well, so this could be, there's a temporary reason to lock this account. Or we want to make sure the person can't log in because, I don't know, maybe there's a legal hold on their account. Maybe they've been terminated, but we need to be able to see what they had in their home directory. Maybe they're away on vacation, and our policies are that these accounts get locked out while they're on vacation. I've seen things like that in like financial institutions, for example, that while people are away, they're actually spot checked for any malicious stuff, right? So maybe those are reasons you might want to do that. All right. So moving on to our next tools, there's sometimes need for changing somebody's password in a quick and easy way, or perhaps just like right from the command line here. And of course, you could just do password, PASSWD, and then the user's name, the user's UI username, that is. And then it'll prompt you interactively to type in the new password, right? That's not really great. I mean, you can do it that way, obviously, but I think it's better to use something like this, right? What we're doing is we're echoing what we want the new password to be through password, passwd, and we're giving it the --stdin flag, which says use standard input to set the password for test user. Now you hit enter, and boom, now they've got a new password. If we were to look back at the Etsy Shadow file, you see here that the hash is now completely different than it was before. and now their password's been changed. Personally, and Scott, you can disagree with me if you want. I don't love that because the password is now in plain text, one on my screen, which isn't that big of a deal, but it's in root's history, right? That's not a great place for a password to be saved. And if I've done this in a script, that means that the script has a plain text password right there in the script. So if you don't like those things, like I don't, then there's another option, which is user mod. There's another flag for user mod that will let you pass in a hash for the password. But of course, that means you need a hash. So there's other tools that'll help you make a hash. Now, this might sound convoluted and extra. However, I did this with Kickstart files, right? Kickstart, you're building a server in an automated fashion. Maybe you want to do something like set the root password to a certain standard that you know is across the board, or maybe you're adding an automation user as part of that Kickstart, and you don't want the clear text password stored in that. This is a perfect use case for that because you can take the time to generate the hash and then put it into the script. And then if someone gets your script, sure, they're going to know that that hash is everywhere, but they're not going to know what the hash is. They're not going to know what that actually reverses to. So there's two tools for that. One of them is a tool you have to install. It's called MK Password, and it'll go interactively. So if I wanted to do, well, what was it? Some password I used before. And then it'll just give you, here's the hash for some password. Now you might notice that the hash is different. That's probably because it used a different salt. I think those are generated on the fly. MK Password has flags you can pass in that says what salt to use and all that stuff if you have standards that you need to follow. The other one is OpenSSL, which is a tool that might already be on your system because that's a pretty standard tool. It might even be included in the RHEL base. But OpenSSL, you do password, PASSWD. That tells OpenSSL to invoke that particular algorithm. And then -6 tells it, I think, what version of the hash to use, right? Maybe I'm wrong about that. But you do that, and again, it's an interactive thing. But it'll ask me to verify it. And as long as I type them both right, boom, there we go. We have a hash there. Now, what do we do with the hash? Well, we just take that hash that we just made. It's already copied to my clipboard. If I do user mod -p, which tells it to set the password. And if you look at the man page, it says to use a crypted password, not the plain text password. And I like to put them in quotes just because it does have a $ in that hash, if you notice, and Bash will sometimes say, oh, that's a variable, and try to, make that, try to read that variable from the system's environment. But if we paste that in, close the single quotes, and then tell it what user, test user, then it should set that exact hash inside of Etsy password, or Etsy shadow, I should say. Okay, there we go. So that's, and notice the quotes aren't there now. So no copy and paste fail this time. Stupid Google.
So Nate,
Yeah.
I think we are set up for a server with GUI or server without GUI type holy war.
Oh, I will fight you.
So here's why I like echoing the password in. MK Password is a great utility, and it can, one of the other things it can do is make random passwords, right? So it'll make like a 8-character password with a mix of case and numbers and okay. But if you're resetting somebody's password, you have to tell them what the password is. Otherwise, how do they know how to log in?
Yeah, well, that's why I'm saying if you use OpenSSL or MK Password and you give it a password, then you can give that to the user.
Yes, but you have to remember it because you didn't. You typed it in. You typed it in, but it's not stored anywhere. So if you're doing things like scripting, you could do something like call MK Password, which makes the password, then send that to a mail command where it'll like stick it in. But it will end up being passed around plain text, but you're also trying to distribute it to the user in plain text. So like it all kind of works out. I get not wanting to have it locally in your possession so that somebody could compromise the root account and then start knowing all these other user accounts. Although I would also argue that if they compromise the user account or the root account, you probably have bigger problems.
Well, yes, this is probably true. So what I'm going to say is there are valid use cases for both scenarios, which is why I showed you both.
Fair enough.
And I'd love to hear in the chat, folks. Tell us which one you prefer. Do you like passing in a clear text password, or do you like using a hash like I did? I think I know what the answer
Star
is going to
said,
be, but we'll see.
we should just write it on a sticky note and put it under our keyboard.
Yeah, that's probably the way to go. Just the sticky notes. Sticky notes are good. All right, I had one last thing, and this is how to lock out an account using Chage or CHage, however you want to pronounce that. And this is for account aging, right? So this is great for either a temporary account, someone who you know is going to be here for 60 days or 90 days or whatever, like like a contract worker, or if you know someone's leaving on a certain date, you can change the age or the lockout date of their account. So first, let's do CHAGE -L, which will list the aging information for test user, right? Now, it tells us right here, the last password change was today because, I kind of just did that. And the account will not expire. It's set to never. The password is not inactive, right? And, sorry, password does not expire. Neither does the, all right, listen, browser, stop popping things up in front of me. Anyway, the expirations are all set to never at this point. So if I were to say, here, I'll copy and paste this so I don't have as much chance of typos. We copy and then paste. There's no funny quotes in this one, so it shouldn't be a problem. We're going to use Chage to set the expiration to yesterday for test user. Right? Now, if I do the -L again, it tells me account expires yesterday. Right? So the account still shows up on the system. The account is still there, but you won't be able to log in with it. And I just want to do that, show you what it looks like in Etsy Shadow one more time. You'll see this number here has been added. That is the expiration date, or I should say the password expiration date for the account, or the lockout date, if you want to call it that. So, I'm showing you this just so that you know that these things end up somewhere, and that somewhere is either Etsy Password or Etsy Shadow. In this case, they've all ended up in Etsy Shadow. Okay, so just to show you what this looks like for poor old Bob, the test user, let's go to a normal user because root will still be able to SU over to test user. So I'm going to a normal user first. And now I'm going to SU-to test user. And it asks me for their password. Now, you might remember I set that to some password. Your account has expired. Please contact your systems administrator. So there we go. Account has expired. Now, of course, you can fix that with Chage, or you could instead maybe enforce a password reset or something, however it is that you want to handle that. But there you go. That's how Chage works. And I think that's all I had for the critical path. Anything new? Any questions came in? Any more arguments you want to have, Scott?
Oh, I always like picking fights. No, we some recommendations from the audience, which is good. We're going to switch to the deeper dive. So stay with us. After the transition, we're going to talk about Pluggable Authentication Modules, or PAM. Don't forget to mash that like and subscribe button to let us know that you like our content and you want us to be notified when we do.
And make sure you comment as to whether you would use a clear text password or a hash, because that's important. We need to know these things.
All right. We'll see you after the transition.
Never clear. I'm telling you, never.
Now is the time where we'll do like audience question and answer if we see things in the chat that are interesting. Remember, if you're a deferred viewer, you're always welcome to leave a comment. And I was just remarking to Granite Penguin that we see him live in the chat today. I often respond to Granite Penguin's comments. So he has experienced the Scott responsing.
The Scott sponsing?
That's right. All right. Before Nate, I did want to touch on central auth. So in our critical path, we talked about locally configured users, which if you have 1,000 machines, would be extremely tedious to manage because you have to touch all those 1,000 machines. So what kind of central auth things can we do?
Yeah. Now, granted, if you're managing thousands of machines, at the very least, I'd be surprised if you didn't have some automation. So you're not touching them, but something is. But there is a better way, and that better way would be centralized authentication. It's just so much easier to deal with accounts at that level, right? Even if you have thousands of accounts and only a few servers, right? Because you can do the management centrally. Now, of course, Red Hat has a solution for that for RHEL called Identity Manager, IDM, based on the free IPA upstream. But there's also a really common use case for centralized authentication in the Windows world, which is Active Directory. And since that's usually in existence already in a lot of environments before centralized authentication for Linux is even a thought, there are ways to use SSSD on RHEL to authenticate your RHEL systems directly to Active Directory. And of course, there's a billion third-party options that also get this done. Different sort of authentication shims that work with PAM, which is what Scott's going to talk about in a bit. That'll make it talk to several other sort of centralized authentication mechanisms. So just know that those things exist. We're not going to go deep into any demos on this. Eric and I are working on a mini series for IDM, which I don't think we have a date set on yet, but keep your eyes out for that. Subscribe to the channel, and you'll see when we bring those out and make them live.
Yeah, and a lot of the central authentication solutions rely on a couple of underlying technologies like LDAP and Kerberos. And so, free IPA can be configured to authenticate to a variety of things. SSSD takes a bunch of options for what you would like to configure it to authenticate against. So it can hook into AD, it can hook into just straight LDAP, it can hook into Kerberos realms, it can hook into a mix of LDAP and Kerberos realms. So there's a lot of options there if you're doing central authentication. So all this, however, even the central auth stuff relies on a locally running service or a locally available service on our machine called PAM. So if we jump into the terminal, we'll take a look at kind of how PAM works. All right. So, hey, Nate, when you log into a machine, did you know that over in etcpam.d that there is a file called login that has the rules for how we authenticate users to log in?
No, I totally didn't know that. Well, I mean, I did know that, but maybe other folks don't.
Um, you can see some other files over here, SSHD. So
Yep.
there's a way that you can have PAM use, or you can have SSHD use PAM, and it would use the rules in the SSHD file. There's sudo, right? So when you run sudo and it's authenticating your user to make sure that you're allowed to sudo things, guess what it's doing? It's using the sudo PAM configuration file. So let's take a look at login for a second. So this is what it looks like. And essentially, PAM is used in a variety of ways to authenticate and set up users to be able to use the system. And so there are several types of rules. So you can see that first column in this file. We have auth rules, which will authenticate someone's identity. Account rules, which verify that their account is in good standing with the system. Password rules. If someone is trying to change their password, this is how we enforce those password changes. And the last set are session rules, which is after we've authenticated them and verified that their account is in good standing. These are the additional things we should do to establish their session with the system. So those are the general types of rules that you'll see in a PAM configuration: auth, account, password, and session. The second column is the severity of the rule. And we'll see a couple different options here. But the ones I'd like to draw your attention to are required and optional. All right, so required means that we're going to run something, we're going to test something, and you're required to get a valid value from that test. And if you don't get a valid value or you get a negative response from the test, you will be unable to progress. Optional, we're going to run this test and we'll get a value back from the test, but we really don't care what it is. If you pass the test, great. If you failed the test, that's okay too. There are a couple others that we will see in our PAM journey. We will see requisite. Requisite and required are similar. Required will actually, if you fail the test, it'll still continue processing the rest of the rules of that type. Whereas requisite, if you fail that test, we don't test any further. So we often see that required is used, but oftentimes requisite is not used, but you may see it sneaking around places. And the other thing that we don't see in this file, but we'll see in another one in just a minute, is sufficient. If you pass this test, that is sufficient that you don't have to pass any other rules that we're checking. So it's like good enough. If you pass this one, it's good enough. All right, and then the third column is the PAM library that it's called, right? We're going to do something to test the state of something or to validate a piece of data. And that's going to come back with a true or false value. And what we're seeing there in that third column is the actual executable or shared object library that's going to be invoked to test some criteria. You can see a little bit further down in this session rule that's optional right here. So these libraries can take arguments. So in this case, we're passing the force argument and the revoke argument. And those arguments can customize the behavior of this test. All right. So that's kind of the overview of what we're looking at in one of these files. But then there's some other weird stuff that I just kind of glossed over, like Substack and include. So Substack says we're going to test a certain amount of stuff from another file in the PAM configuration, and include is a similar thing. We're going to include rules of this type from another file. So it's common to do things like check someone's password. And so we could put the PAM test, check someone's password in login and SSHD and SU and sudo and like all these individual configuration files. Or because it's so common, we could put it in one place, system auth, and then everybody checks it there. That way, if we want to make a change, like add an argument to how passwords are being checked, we can add it to the system auth entry. And because everyone else refers to that other file, us changing that file makes everybody else pick up the change. All right, so that's what the include in Substack does, is it allows us to reference rules stored somewhere else for this service or PAM check. All right, so now it starts to get pretty complicated because if we look over at system auth, so there's more account, auth, password, and session rules. And those were included from our login set of rules that we had to check. And so I kind of mashed these two files together so we could trace through what a sample login authentication would look like. All right. So on the left side is the rules from login. And at several points, we saw that the login rules called the system auth rules. And so what I did was I put the system auth rules on the right side and I positioned them in the correct locations. And so that's why there's like gaps between the two of them, is because we like go over here and check some rules, and then we come back over here, and then we go over here to check some rules, and then we come back over here. All right. So if you're logging into the system on one of the TTYs, we're going to authenticate your user, right? Did you provide me the right password for a user that exists on the system? So the PAM login file says, oh, we should use the rules out of system auth for that. So there are three rules over in system auth. The first one is required. So we're going to set some environment variables, and the PAM env library will always return a true value unless you're not able to execute it for some reason. So if you're not able to run PAM env, that's when you get a failure. And notice this is a required rule. So if you fail a required rule, you're not able to authenticate. But the environment variable setting stuff in PAM is pretty much bulletproof. So you're going to get a pass on that. Like you'd have to have maybe somebody deleted this file. That's how you would fail that rule. All right, the next one is a sufficient rule. So if you pass this sufficient rule, that's good enough, and we don't have to check anything else. And we make a call to PAM Unix. PAM Unix is the thing that does Unix style authentication. So we asked you for your password and your account, like your username, and we're going to go over, we're going to check it against something to make sure that that's the right stuff. And so I'm going to put Nate on the spot. Nate, when you're checking a username and password on a machine, where do you look?
For a local machine, it'd be Etsy password and Etsy shadow.
Yep. And so PAM Unix takes that user account you gave as your username, checks it against its password, takes that password you gave, checks it against Etsy Shadow. And if you are successful in doing that, then you've proved that you're authorized or authenticated to the system. We can go back over to login and we can run that next auth rule, which is called post login. But if you gave me the wrong username and password, and we're not able to validate it with our standard Unix authentication stuff, then you get a PAM deny call, and PAM deny will always fail. Always. And because it's required, because you failed the required rule, you can't authenticate to the system. All right, now the reason that we do this, and let me go into edit mode here, is if we had multiple ways to authenticate people. So we were just talking about authenticating against a central authentication location. So if you were to configure, say, LDAP, what would happen is if you use one of the Red Hat tools to configure yourself against LDAP, it would put a extra rule in SystemAuth and probably a couple other places like this. So there's a library for PAM called PAM LDAP that handles LDAP authentication. And so what we would do is if you're logging into the system, we'd first check to see if you're giving me a local user account. And if you're giving me a local user account, that's good enough. You've proved that you've authenticated. But if you fail to give me a local user account, then I'm going to check the LDAP server. And if you gave me a correct LDAP server user account and password, that's good enough. And I'll let you into the machine. But if you neither give me a local account, nor give me a LDAP server user account that's correct, then you get PAM deny, which doesn't let you authenticate. Right? So the more authentication methods you configure for the machine, the more of these sufficient rules you'll see in there, because we're going to try them in order to see if, is it from this person or is it stored over here in this source, so that we can give you multiple different ways of potentially authenticating the machine.
Does and this may be off script, but does PAM have an implied deny at the end? So if someone were to do something dumb like drop that PAM deny, would they still get denied if they didn't succeed in any of these, or would it default to letting them in? That'd be silly.
Yeah. So it depends on what the other rules are. But
Right.
yes, if you pass the required rule of PAM env, and you didn't get either of these sufficient rules because you didn't have a local user account or an LDAP user account, well, you're not required to pass a sufficient rule. So potentially you passed all the required rules, and that's good enough. So the PAM deny is there to make sure that if you don't match any of the sufficients, you
Right.
will denial. And it's required, which means if you fail it, you can't authenticate. So yeah, ordering in these files can be important. The actual libraries that are called can be important. So that's
Now that can be daunting to edit by hand like this. So there are tools that make this easier. I don't know if you had mentioned that. I was busy looking at chat. But there's authconfig, I think, still exists, or something similar to it that'll help you configure PAM rules.
yeah. And In fact, if we look at the original PAM configuration files that I went from, oops, system auth, notice that it says at the very top, there's a comment that says, this file is auto-generated.
There
The
you
next
go.
time you run auth select, it'll obliterate this file.
There
And
you
so,
go. I'll select. That's the tool I'm looking for.
yeah. So if you're using manual changes to this file, you can't use any of the automated stuff anymore because it'll not know about your manual changes. All right. So I wanted to, now that we kind of understand the flow of PAM, I want to come back and actually show some changes. All right. So our first one, I mentioned that PAM libraries will take options. So I'm going to become the RHEL user, and I'm going to look at the UMask for the RHEL user. And Nate, something that's bothered me recently was there was a change in UMask behavior in RHEL 9, where if you were in a private group, it set your UMask more restrictively to remove write permissions from the group by default. And I couldn't figure out where that was coming from, but I figured out when we were setting up for this episode.
Learn
So
something new every day.
we used to set the UMask in one of the login files in like one of the, I think it was Etsy bash RC. And that no longer is how we set it. Instead, in post login,
Hmm.
we have these session rules, and these session rules are to craft the user's session on the machine. And one of them is PAM UMask, which sets the user's UMask.
Well, now you know. Now you know what to file a bug against if you don't like it.
And so what we can do is we can change the options passed to PAM UMask to change its behavior.
Very nice.
Passing the argument saying my machine uses user private groups or user groups, the PAM library that's responsible for setting the UMask for your session, there you go. Sets it to the user private group UMask instead.
Or you can just dump UMask 0002 into everyone's bash RC.
That's right. And
Totally
do that for
inefficient, but
every new user that you create too, because you got to keep propagating the change.
yeah.
Or you can just
And hope it never changes, because then you have to change it for all the users.
right, right. Or you can just add an argument to the spam library, and there you go. It's now effective for all users that log into the machine that have their username and their primary group name are the same things.
Stop with your simple and efficient administration ideas.
I refuse. The other thing I wanted to show you is we talked about like how you could add um, different authentication sources. Well, it turns out there are additional PAM libraries you can add too. And a bunch of them come with RHEL. So like the LDAP one, the IDM
Mhm.
or IDM or AD integration stuff, that all comes with RHEL. But there are others that are extra. And where do we go for extra packages, Nate?
Apple.
That's right.
It's in the name. Extra packages for enterprise Linux.
So I'm just going to do a DNF list available for PAM. And you can see that, oh, whoops. Well, this machine doesn't have Apple installed. Well, that's not great.
Poor planning, Scott.
Yeah, well, I used a different sandbox for last night when I was doing all my testing.
At least you didn't give poor Bob a generic username like test user. I'm so embarrassed.
Uh, Indeed. All right, 1 second. I'm grabbing.
Scott is frantically Googling for the command to enable Apple.
That's right.
And of course, the reason it's not enabled out of the box is because these are extra packages that are not supported by Red Hat support. So when you install a RHEL system, Apple is certainly an option. It can certainly give you things that are not included with RHEL. Just keep in mind that not supported by Red Hat.
All right, let's see here. All right, so we'll install the Apple repository. And then I'll do my DNF list again. And it's downloading all the metadata from Apple. There we go. All right. So you can see there's a PAM radius. So if you have a radius server, you can authenticate that with PAM radius.
Man, radius. You're taking me back. Taking me
Yep.
back. Radius.
Use it. Of course, some people still use RHEL 4, but there's PAM. You can like authenticate with your YubiKeys. And the one I'm going to throw is PAM 2FA, right? Which is for two-factor authentication.
Good choice. There was a lot of conversation about multi-factor and two-factor in the chat. So there you go. Good choice there, Scott.
Well, sometimes I make good choices.
Yeah.
Not often.
You saw the future and you knew this.
All right. So when you install a module, so for example, we have some that already came with RHEL, like PAM Unix. They have man pages. So if you wanted to read about like what arguments you can pass or what the arguments do, there's documentation for all of these. But I just installed PAM 2FA. And unfortunately, PAM 2FA does not have a man page. It does, however, have a markdown-based README. All right, so it says, hey, here's PAM 2FA. You could do two-factor authentication, including things like Google Authenticator, YubiKey, OTP. So there's a bunch of options for how you're doing your two-factor authentication. All right, we don't need to worry about building it because we got it from Apple already built. All right, and then it says, okay, to use this, you need to put this into your thing, into your PAM config. So, oops, we're going to go into Etsy, PAM.d, system auth. We're just going to throw it in there. All right, that's cool.
Good idea. What could go wrong?
Yeah, we can put it anywhere we want. Can't we?
Probably not.
No.
Shouldn't it be after the ENV at least? Or is it should be after the password, like after the PAM Unix?
Well, who knows? But let me tell you some decision criteria you might use. So I like your idea that should be below PAM ENV because we know that sets environment variables for the PAM. All right. So let's fix that. All right. Now, should it be above or below PAM Unix? So PAM Unix checks for local user accounts. So if it's okay that somebody types in their username and password, and that is all that's needed, then maybe it should be below.
Well, and I don't know if this is the right way to do it or not, but in my brain, I'm thinking you change PAM Unix to required, not sufficient, and the MFA to also required, right?
So I think you don't want to do that because if you change the PAM Unix to required, that means I am requiring a local user account to log in. So I actually think that maybe for the purposes of this, we could do something like that. And then depending on what you want to do, you could change it to be sufficient. So it's okay if you have a local username and password without two-factor authentication. Maybe that's what the PAM Unix line currently says.
Yeah.
And 2FA,
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. So what we could do is this. Which says, okay, if you authenticate with your two-factor authentication, that's good enough. And we don't have to go any further. But if you're not able to authenticate with two-factor, if you're a local user account, that would also be acceptable. Or
But isn't the whole
maybe
point of two-factor that I'm forcing you to do both? It should be a password and the second factor. That's why I thought they should be set to required.
so if you are using two-factor, that's good enough. But that's the only thing that's good enough. So if you don't successfully authenticate with two-factor, you get that PAM deny, which kicks you out.
Okay. Does the two-factor module also ask you for your password then?
It will. And so if we go
There.
back,
That's what I'm missing. Okay. I didn't
Yeah.
look at the man page.
that's probably my fault. All right. So down here, they give you the arguments that can be passed to the two-factor module.
Okay.
Things like your LDAP URI, right? What's the LDAP server that you authenticate against? Or the Google authentication stuff that you authenticate against. So there's options there. Or maybe we do PAM Unix where we log in with their username and password. That's good, but then we also require that they put in a token or something with two-factor. So it would be good enough to have the local user account, but you also are required to put in the two-factor, token code or something in order to complete the authentication. But ordering is important. The severity that you
Yes.
type is important because that's going to dictate how PAM treats the requirements for your login. All right, so I'm going to do something silly. Oops. All right. So here's what I've done. Nate, you'll notice that I've not added any arguments to my 2FA.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's no way.
Seems bad.
Yeah, and it's required, so like it's going to fail. So right, so it'll ask me, hey, what's your password? Oh, hold on, that worked. I wasn't expecting it to work. Oh, I remember why. Hold on, I put it in the wrong file.
Oh, we have these tests, Scott.
That's right. So I added my stuff over in system auth.
Oh, but not SSH or remote auth or whatever it's called.
Password auth, yeah. So let me all right, so let's try this. There we go. All right, now that I've properly broken the system,
Broken it in the right way.
that's right. Not broken it in the wrong way that I can't troubleshoot and fix. All right. So this is the same kind of dialogue that you would get if you put in the wrong password. And I know that was a question earlier, we were talking about it earlier with like, if I lock a password, what happens? This is the kind of thing that happens. We don't want to give away information that the state of the machine is the problem. So even though we're failing this PAM call, we're not told it's because we're failing this PAM call. However, as root on the local machine, we are told right here, bam, PAM 2FA is failing because there's no configured second factors. And then we end up not being able to pass our PAM config because even though I'm providing the right password, I'm not able to get a valid response on the PAM 2FA library call. And again, if we do something like change the severity of our rule, so I went from required to optional, Now it doesn't matter whether I pass or fail the PAM 2FA module. Right, it lets me log into the system. Now it did provide the local user account some error messaging saying, hey, this thing's not working right. You should contact somebody. But that was because I was successfully able to authenticate with my local user account, which allowed me to progress through the PAM stack of authentication checks, session checks, and account checks.
Congratulations.
So,
You've
yeah.
successfully configured but incorrectly multi-factor.
Well, and if we looked at the Varlog Secure, it would still complain that we're failing that
Yeah,
check, right?
right.
So if you're messing around with PAM stuff, and two words of warning: one, have an open session as root, because even root authenticates with PAM. So if you mess
Yeah,
with PAM, you can't authenticate anymore. You're not going to be able to authenticate new root sessions. So have
you
an
can lock
open,
yourself out pretty good if you mess up PAM good enough.
yeah. Um, so you have an open login session so that you can use that to change anything that might be incorrect. Test, test, and then look at things like Varlook Secure to verify that your tests aren't producing errors that maybe you just aren't noticing because other PAM checks are passing because you have the wrong severity or something else. So Nate, I have not been watching chat. Anything interesting or questions
There,
that have,
there's been a healthy back and forth about PAM and about auth config versus auth select. I don't think there were any questions that we need to answer, though.
all right. Well, I'll remind folks to like if they've enjoyed today's show. If you're not already subscribed, subscribe so you'll get notifications when we're doing more of these. For next steps, um, so we have a basic user management lab. So if you're interested in like adding users, deleting users, adding them in groups, we have a hands-on lab for that. I'll make sure to put it in the show notes after the show. Um, our next into the terminal, Nate. Next into the terminal,
We're going to be talking about compliance with OpenSCAP.
and we have a guest person, don't we?
Yeah, yeah. You may see him in the chat right now too. Should we reveal the secret, or did we make people wait?
That's up to you because I won't be
He
there.
he's got blue hair or light blue hair. Anyway, our faithful viewer Jay Scar, who's got a nice background in security and compliance, is going to join us. So as long as everybody's schedules line up, that's what you should be able to expect for next week.
And so we're going to be doing a couple episodes with JSCAR of how do I set up my machine to comply with security standard. And we're going to do a couple episodes of different security standards. So next week is our first one of those on Friday.
Right.
Also next week, producer Eric and Richard Rios, also in the chat. Maybe all of our hosts watch our shows. They're
Got to
doing,
bump the numbers up somehow, Scott.
that's right. We'll just keep inviting people to do shows, and that's how we'll attract viewers.
Yeah.
Um, they're going to do the fourth episode of their satellite miniseries, which is standardization and management at scale. So if you missed their episode this week, which was filmed, I think it's yesterday, it's live in the channel. Please feel free to check it out. And they will be doing standardization and management at scale next week.
Satellite is good stuff. So yeah, go check it out.
Yeah. And I think that runs us off our prepared remarks. So until
You
next
could
time.
start making up unprepared remarks if you want. That always goes so well.
That's right. What could possibly go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong? Thanks everybody for watching today. I think we had a good time and did a bunch of PAM, did a bunch of account lockouts. Poor Bob goes by the nickname test user.
You don't work here no more.
He don't work here no more.
All right, everyone. Have an excellent day and see you next week.
Yep. Have a great one.